Welcome, everyone. Today we'll be discussing global stratification, the way inequality operates not just within societies, but across the entire world. Although poverty exists in Canada and other nations, the deepest social inequality isn't found within individual countries. It's found between them. Global stratification refers to the patterns of social inequality that exist on a global scale. When we take a worldwide perspective, the level of inequality is far greater than what we see within Canada alone. To make sense of these differences, sociologists have developed various ways of classifying countries based on their levels of wealth and development. After the Second World War, the world was often divided into three broad categories. The First World referred to high-income, industrialized countries. The Second World referred to socialist countries. And the Third World described non-industrialized, low-income nations. Over time, however, this system became less useful. The so-called Second World largely disappeared with the decline of socialist states, and the Third World label came to include an enormous range of societies with very different levels of development. Today, a more accurate and flexible way to think about global inequality is to use the categories of high-income, middle-income, and low-income countries. This newer approach focuses not on political systems, but on levels of economic development. It reflects the continuing diversity and complexity of the global economy and helps us better understand how inequality operates on a worldwide scale. Let's begin with high-income countries, the wealthiest nations in the world. These societies are defined by their high overall standards of living, advanced industrial technology, and strong, stable economies. Because of their high levels of productivity and technological innovation, they are able to generate enough goods and services to provide most of their citizens with a comfortable material life. Many of the world's major companies, especially those that design and market advanced technology such as computers, smartphones, and software, are based in these nations, and most of their consumers also live there. High-income countries include most of Western Europe, Canada, the United States, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and Israel. In Latin America, Mexico, Argentina, and Chile also fall into this category. These nations typically have stable governments, strong infrastructure, and well-developed systems of healthcare, education, and social support, allowing them to sustain high living standards for the majority of their populations. In economic terms, these countries have an income range between about $15,000 and $60,000 per person annually. Although they represent about 46% of the world's population, they enjoy roughly 64% of the world's total income. Their production systems are capital intensive, relying on technology and automation rather than manual labor, and they are at the forefront of the global information revolution, leading innovation in science, technology, and communication. High-income nations also control much of the world's financial markets, giving them substantial influence over global trade and investment. Despite their wealth and technological advancement, significant cultural and economic differences exist both within and among these nations. While most citizens benefit from relatively high standards of living, inequality and social divisions can still be found, reminding us that even in the world's richest countries, prosperity is not always evenly shared. Next, let's look at middle-income countries, which make up a large and diverse group within the global economy. These nations fall somewhere between the world's richest and poorest countries, with standards of living that sit around the global average. On average, per capita incomes range from about $4,000 to $15,000 per year, though some sources place the lower end closer to $2,500. Middle-income countries are home to about 41% of the world's population and cover roughly 20% of the world's land area. Around 54% of people in these nations live in urban areas, often working in industrial or service sector jobs, while the remaining 46% live in rural areas, where poverty is more widespread and access to healthcare, education, and clean water is often limited. Examples of middle-income countries include Colombia, Armenia, and Lebanon on the higher end, and Cambodia, Kenya, and Pakistan on the lower end. Many former socialist nations, such as Ukraine and Uzbekistan, also fall into this category, as do Peru, Ecuador, Namibia, South Africa, India, and Vietnam. What's important to remember is that middle-income countries are highly diverse. Some are rapidly industrializing and improving living standards, while others still face major economic and social challenges. Industrialization remains limited in many of these nations, and access to social services like healthcare, education, and housing can be inconsistent. Still, these countries play an increasingly important role in the global economy, often serving as key sites of manufacturing, resource production, and emerging markets for global trade. Finally, we come to low-income countries, which face the most severe economic challenges in the world today. These nations have low standards of living, and the majority of their populations live in poverty. Their economies are primarily agrarian, meaning that most people depend on subsistence farming, growing food mainly for their own families rather than for sale or export. Industrialization and technological development are limited, which makes it difficult for these societies to generate sustained economic growth. Low-income countries are home to about 13% of the world's population, spread across roughly 15% of the planet's land area. They are largely concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South and Southeast Asia. Around 64% of people in these nations live in rural areas, while only 36% live in cities. Access to basic necessities, such as food, clean drinking water, medical care, sanitation, and adequate housing, is often limited. As a result, hunger and disease remain widespread problems. Because of weak infrastructure, limited educational opportunities, and scarce investment, low-income countries often struggle to break out of the cycle of poverty. The lack of technology and industrial capacity further restricts development, leaving many people vulnerable to economic instability and environmental challenges. Examples of low-income countries include many nations in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, where poverty rates remain high and economic opportunities are limited. When we compare high, middle, and low-income countries, the depth of global inequality becomes clear. Differences in wealth, technology, and access to essential resources shape people's lives in profound ways. Understanding these disparities helps us see the global challenge of building a more equitable and sustainable world. When we think about global inequality, it's also important to remember that wealth and poverty are deeply interconnected. The prosperity of high-income nations often depends, at least in part, on the labor and resources that come from poorer countries. Many low-income regions supply raw materials, agricultural goods, or cheap labor that feed into industries and markets in wealthier nations. This global economic relationship helps maintain the comfort and abundance of life in some parts of the world while limiting opportunities in others. At the same time, the effects of poverty reach far beyond economic hardship. In low-income countries, children are more likely to face malnutrition, limited education, and preventable diseases. Families often have to make difficult choices, such as keeping children home from school to work or care for siblings. These challenges make it harder to escape the cycle of poverty and can have long-term impacts on health and life expectancy. We also need to consider how poverty affects communities and entire nations. Limited access to education and healthcare weakens a country's ability to develop a skilled workforce. Poor infrastructure, such as inadequate roads, sanitation, and energy systems, further restricts economic growth. In this way, global inequality isn't just about who has more or less money. It's about how differences in opportunity shape the future of entire societies. Despite the seriousness of these challenges, progress is possible. Over the past few decades, many countries have made real strides in reducing extreme poverty, improving education, and expanding access to clean water and healthcare. These improvements remind us that global inequality isn't fixed. It's shaped by policy decisions, international cooperation, and collective action. The more we understand about global wealth and poverty, the better equipped we are to imagine and build a world that offers everyone the chance at a decent life. Since the early 2000s, the world had actually been making steady progress in reducing extreme poverty. Even with challenges like military conflicts and droughts linked to climate change, global poverty rates were consistently moving downward. Then came 2020, and the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted that progress in a dramatic way. When the pandemic hit, economies around the world slowed to a crawl. Jobs disappeared, trade declined, and millions of people, especially those in low and middle income countries, lost their sources of income almost overnight. As a result, the number of people living in extreme poverty jumped by around 100 million, marking the first global increase in poverty levels this century. By 2021, as the effects of the pandemic began to ease and economies slowly started to recover, the number of people living in extreme poverty fell again by roughly 20 million. Still, the damage was significant. Tens of millions of people who fell into poverty during the pandemic remain poor today, and many will continue to feel the effects for years to come. It's also important to note that not all parts of the world were affected equally. High-income regions experienced far less harm, largely because they had stronger healthcare systems, more stable economies, and the resources to cushion the blow through government support programs. In contrast, low-income countries faced deeper setbacks, making it clear once again how global inequality shapes who suffers most during times of crisis. And then we have to think about how poverty affects children, which is honestly one of the hardest realities to face. Children, especially in low-income countries, are among the most vulnerable to the effects of poverty. Growing up without access to stable housing, education, or healthcare can shape the entire course of their lives and make it incredibly difficult to break free from the cycle of poverty as adults. In the world's poorest nations, roughly 100 million children are forced to work or live on the streets, trying to survive by begging, stealing, or engaging in dangerous forms of labor, including sex work. Tens of millions have left their families altogether, living on their own with little to no protection or support. The extent and severity of child poverty is greatest in low-income countries, but it's particularly visible in parts of Latin America. About half of all street children in the world are found in Latin American cities, where half of all children already grow up in poverty. In many cities, local officials have even turned to harsh measures known as urban cleansing, where street children are rounded up in efforts to make city centers appear safer or more appealing to tourists. These actions not only ignore the root causes of poverty, but also place already vulnerable children in even greater danger. When we think about poverty on a global scale, it's crucial to remember that behind the statistics are millions of children whose futures are being shaped by these conditions. Their experiences remind us that global inequality isn't just about economics. It's about human lives and the next generation's chance at stability and dignity. And speaking of vulnerability, women face some of the greatest hardships when it comes to poverty. Around 70% of the people living in absolute poverty are women, which is a staggering figure. This inequality doesn't just happen by chance. It's rooted in traditional norms, social expectations, and unequal access to resources and opportunities. In many societies, a woman's work is often unrecognized, undervalued, and underpaid. Women are frequently concentrated in low-wage jobs and make up the majority of workers in sweatshops and informal labor markets, where conditions are harsh and pay is minimal. Even though women produce close to 40% of the world's food, men own most of the land, leaving women with little control over the resources they help create. Access to reproductive health care is another major factor. In many low-income countries, most women have limited or no access to birth control or maternal health care. This not only contributes to higher birth rates, but also limits women's ability to pursue education or paid work, which in turn slows overall economic growth. While women everywhere face forms of inequality, those in low-income nations experience far greater disadvantages than women in wealthier societies. The lack of access to healthcare, education, and property rights reinforces poverty across generations. Understanding this connection between gender and poverty is essential, because when women have the resources and freedom to make choices about their lives, whole communities benefit. Now, here's where poverty and exploitation take a very dark turn: modern forms of slavery. It's unsettling to think about, but slavery still exists today in various forms around the world. According to Anti-Slavery International, millions of people are trapped in systems of control and exploitation that deny them freedom, dignity, and basic human rights. One form is descent-based slavery, where one person actually owns another. This kind of slavery is hereditary, passed down through generations within certain families or communities. People born into it have virtually no chance of escaping. There's also slavery imposed by the state, where governments force people into labor, sometimes as punishment for crimes or as part of public projects. In some cases, citizens are required to work under coercive conditions with little or no pay. Another form is child slavery, which includes children who are sent to the streets to beg or steal, or who are forced into dangerous or exploitative labor. Many are abandoned or trafficked, ending up in conditions that strip them of any chance at a normal childhood. Then we have debt bondage, where workers are trapped in a cycle of debt to their employers. They're paid so little that they can never fully repay what they owe, keeping them effectively enslaved. Servile forms of marriage are another type. In these cases, women are forced into marriage against their will, treated as property, and sometimes pushed into prostitution or lifelong servitude. Finally, there's human trafficking, one of the most devastating modern forms of slavery. It involves the movement of men, women, and children, often across borders, for the purpose of forced labor, sexual exploitation, or other forms of abuse. These modern versions of slavery may look different from those of the past, but the underlying reality is the same: people being stripped of their freedom and used for the benefit of others. It's one of the clearest and most disturbing reminders of how deeply inequality and exploitation are still woven into the global system today. So now let's look at some of the major explanations for global poverty. Factors that help us understand why it's so widespread and persistent in many regions. There isn't just one cause. Poverty is shaped by a combination of historical, economic, social, and cultural forces that work together to keep certain nations trapped in cycles of disadvantage. One of the biggest factors is limited technology. In many low-income countries, the lack of modern technology makes it difficult to produce goods efficiently, provide quality healthcare, or expand education. Without access to up-to-date tools and innovations, productivity remains low, which slows economic growth and limits improvements in living standards. Another key factor is high population growth. In many poorer nations, populations are growing rapidly, placing enormous pressure on already scarce resources. More people means greater demand for food, jobs, housing, and healthcare. But when economic growth can't keep up, living standards decline, and poverty becomes harder to reduce. We also have to consider cultural patterns that emphasize tradition. In many low-income societies, strong attachment to traditional customs can sometimes make it difficult to adopt new ideas or technologies that could improve living conditions. For instance, continuing to rely on traditional farming techniques might prevent communities from using more efficient agricultural methods that could increase yields and income. Another major factor is pronounced social stratification, the deep internal inequality found within many societies. In some low-income countries, a small elite controls most of the wealth and power, while the vast majority of people struggle to meet basic needs. This concentration of resources makes it extremely difficult for those at the bottom to move upward, locking entire groups into long-term poverty. And finally, we can't overlook gender inequality. Women and girls in many low-income countries face limited access to education, property ownership, and employment opportunities. They are often expected to take on domestic roles or have large families, which further restricts their economic independence. This not only limits individual potential, but also reduces overall economic productivity and keeps families trapped in poverty. Altogether, these factors interact in complex ways to maintain global inequality. Understanding them helps us see that poverty isn't simply the result of individual failure. It's the outcome of larger structural forces that shape opportunities and constrain progress around the world. Then, there is global power relationships, which play a major role in keeping the poorest nations at a disadvantage. This factor is a bit more complex, but it's crucial to understanding how inequality operates on a global scale. Historically, many low-income countries were controlled by wealthier ones through colonialism. During that period, colonial powers extracted vast amounts of wealth: gold, oil, agricultural products, and other valuable resources from the territories they controlled. The profits from this extraction flowed out of the colonies and into the hands of high-income nations, leaving behind economies that were dependent, underdeveloped, and often deeply unequal. The effects of that history are still felt today, as many of these former colonies continue to struggle with poverty and limited infrastructure. Even though colonialism as a political system has ended, a new and more subtle form of exploitation, neocolonialism, continues to shape global inequality. Instead of direct political control, neocolonialism works through economic dominance. Large multinational corporations, many based in high-income countries, operate in low-income nations to take advantage of cheap labor and natural resources. While these corporations make enormous profits, very little of that wealth stays within the host countries. Most of the benefits go back to the corporations or to small local elites, leaving the majority of people with few improvements in their standard of living. So, when we look at all these factors together, limited technology, high population growth, traditional cultural patterns, internal inequalities, gender disparities, and global power dynamics, we start to see why poverty is so difficult to break. Each of these forces reinforces the others, creating a powerful cycle that keeps many nations trapped in conditions of persistent inequality. Overcoming this cycle requires not just economic growth, but real structural change, both within countries and in the global relationships that connect them. All right, so now let's get into theories of global stratification. In other words, the big ideas that help explain why wealth and power are distributed so unequally around the world. There are two major perspectives we'll focus on today: modernization theory and dependency theory. Each offers a very different way of understanding the roots of global inequality, and both have their own strengths and weaknesses. Let's start with modernization theory. This theory explains global inequality by looking at technological progress and cultural change. The basic idea is that a country's level of economic development depends on how modern it is. That is, how much it has adopted industrial technology, rational planning, and modern cultural values. According to this view, societies develop in stages, and poorer nations can eventually achieve prosperity by following the same path that high-income countries once took. From a historical perspective, modernization theory points to the industrial revolutions of the past as key turning points. High-income nations were able to raise their standards of living over time because industrialization brought advances in production, medicine, education, and infrastructure. These developments didn't just improve the economy, they also improved quality of life for large portions of the population. Another important element of modernization theory is the role of culture. The theory argues that deeply traditional cultural patterns can act as barriers to development. Societies that place heavy emphasis on tradition, resisting change or innovation, may struggle to adopt the technologies, work habits, and economic systems needed for industrial growth. By contrast, cultures that encourage education, entrepreneurship, and openness to change are more likely to experience economic progress. In short, modernization theory sees global inequality as largely the result of internal differences among nations, particularly differences in technology, culture, and values. From this perspective, economic development comes from embracing modern ways of thinking and organizing society. According to modernization theory, high-income nations play a key role in promoting global development. The idea is that wealthier countries can help poorer ones modernize by taking several steps: controlling population growth so that resources can be better managed, increasing food production to reduce hunger, introducing industrial technology to boost productivity, and providing foreign aid to support infrastructure, education, and healthcare. From this perspective, the path to progress involves following the example of the most industrialized nations and adopting the technologies, values, and social systems that helped them succeed. Modernization theory has been widely supported among social scientists, and has significantly influenced the foreign policies of many high-income nations. It has shaped international development programs and aid strategies aimed at helping poorer countries move toward industrialization and economic growth. However, the theory has also faced strong criticism. One major critique is that modernization simply hasn't occurred in many low-income countries, even after decades of aid and exposure to Western technologies. Critics argue that the theory overlooks how high-income nations often block or limit the development of poorer ones through economic and political control. It also tends to treat high and low-income countries as if they exist in separate, isolated worlds, ignoring the complex web of global relationships and historical ties, like colonialism, that have shaped all nations. Another criticism is that modernization theory reflects a strong ethnocentric bias. It holds up the world's wealthiest and most industrialized nations as the standard for judging everyone else, implying that the modern Western way of life is the ideal model for development. This perspective fails to appreciate cultural diversity and assumes that all societies should follow the same path toward progress. Finally, some argue that modernization theory ends up blaming the victims, suggesting that poorer countries are responsible for their own struggles because they haven't adopted modern values or technologies, without acknowledging the structural inequalities and historical disadvantages that continue to hold them back. Overall, modernization theory provides a clear, structured explanation for why some nations are wealthier than others. It emphasizes the importance of adopting modern technology and culture, with high-income nations serving as the model for success. But as we'll see next, not everyone agrees with this approach. Now let's turn to dependency theory, which offers a very different way of understanding global inequality. Dependency theory is a model of economic and social development that explains inequality in terms of the historical exploitation of poor nations by rich ones. Instead of viewing poverty as the result of internal shortcomings, like a lack of technology or traditional culture, this theory focuses on external forces. It argues that the wealth of rich countries has been built on the poverty of poor ones. From a historical perspective, dependency theorists point out that many low-income countries were actually better off in the past than their descendants are today. Before colonialism, these societies were largely self-sufficient, with their own systems of trade, agriculture, and production. But the colonial process disrupted that independence. European powers colonized vast parts of the world, taking control of land, labor, and natural resources. At its height, Great Britain alone controlled nearly 1/4 of the world's land. Between the 1500s and the mid-1800s, both Europeans and Africans participated in the transatlantic slave trade, which further enriched European economies at the expense of millions of enslaved people and colonized societies. The prosperity of high-income nations, then, came directly at the expense of low-income ones. Colonizers extracted enormous wealth from the territories they controlled: gold, crops, raw materials, while forcing colonies into economic dependence. The result was a global system in which poor societies were underdeveloped rather than simply undeveloped. In other words, their poverty wasn't natural or inevitable. It was created through exploitation that stripped them of their resources and economic potential. Although formal colonialism has largely disappeared, dependency theory argues that the same unequal pattern continues today in the form of neocolonialism. Instead of direct political rule, wealthier nations now exercise economic control through multinational corporations, foreign investment, and global trade agreements. These arrangements allow rich countries and their corporations to profit from cheap labor and raw materials in poorer nations, while most of the benefits flow back to high-income economies or to a small elite within low-income countries. This ongoing system keeps poorer nations economically dependent and unable to develop on their own terms. According to dependency theory, neocolonialism lies at the very heart of the global capitalist system. The structure of the world economy continues to favor those already at the top, ensuring that wealth and power remain concentrated in the hands of high-income nations, while low-income countries remain trapped in cycles of dependency and disadvantage. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of dependency theory? One of its biggest strengths is that it highlights the interconnected nature of the world's economies. It reminds us that no country's economy operates in isolation. Global relationships have real and lasting effects on development. However, critics point out several limitations. One concern is that dependency theory tends to assume that wealth works like a zero-sum game, meaning one country's gain must come at another's loss. In reality, global trade and cooperation can sometimes lead to mutual growth, and some nations with close ties to wealthier countries have managed to achieve real economic progress. Another criticism is that dependency theory overlooks the role of internal cultural and social factors. While it focuses heavily on external exploitation, it doesn't account for how traditional norms, political corruption, or lack of education can also contribute to persistent poverty. Critics also note that the theory downplays other kinds of dependency, such as those created by the former Soviet Union during the Cold War. Finally, while dependency theory does a strong job of describing the problem, it doesn't offer clear solutions. It explains how global inequality developed and continues to operate, but it provides little guidance for how low-income nations might escape the dependency cycle. Now let's take a closer look at Wallerstein's capitalist world economy, which builds on the ideas of dependency theory and provides another way to understand global inequality. This model argues that the prosperity or poverty of any nation can't be understood in isolation. It's a direct result of its position within the global economic system. According to Wallerstein, the world economy is divided into three main zones: the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery. High-income nations make up the core of the world economy. These are the countries that control most of the world's wealth, technology, and production systems. They dominate global trade and benefit the most from the flow of goods and capital. At the opposite end are the peripheral nations, or low-income countries. These societies provide raw materials, cheap labor, and agricultural goods to the global market, but they rarely benefit from the profits their resources generate. Their economies are heavily dependent on exports, and they often lack the industrial base needed to produce finished goods for themselves. Between the two is the semi-periphery, made up of the remaining countries, often middle-income nations, that have some level of industrialization, but still depend on trade with the core nations. These countries can experience both exploitation and limited benefit within the world system, often acting as a kind of buffer zone between the rich and the poor regions of the world. In this global system, the world economy benefits high-income nations by generating profits and maintaining their dominance, but it harms the rest of the world by perpetuating dependency and poverty. Peripheral nations remain trapped in a cycle of disadvantage due to three main factors: narrow, export-oriented economies, lack of industrial capacity, and massive foreign debt. These structural conditions keep poorer nations reliant on wealthier ones for investment, manufactured goods, and financial aid, making it difficult for them to achieve real independence or sustainable growth. When we compare this with other theories, we can see how the role of rich nations is interpreted differently. Modernization theory argues that high-income countries create wealth through capital investment and technological innovation, suggesting that their development can help others modernize as well. Dependency theory and world systems analysis, on the other hand, see things very differently. They argue that global inequality is rooted in how wealth is distributed, claiming that high-income nations have effectively overdeveloped themselves, while underdeveloping the rest of the world. From this perspective, efforts like population control or boosting agricultural output often do little to help the poorest populations. Instead, these strategies tend to benefit wealthy countries and local elites in poor nations. Multinational corporations frequently cooperate with those elites to maintain profits, focusing on export crops or resource extraction rather than producing food for local people. As a result, the global economic system continues to favor the powerful, keeping the benefits of development concentrated in the hands of a few, while much of the world remains stuck on the periphery. So, where does all of this leave us when we think about the future of global stratification? We've explored modernization theory and dependency theory, two very different ways of understanding global inequality, and both offer valuable insights into where we might be headed. Modernization theory makes a strong point. The development of the global economy is deeply connected to technology and productivity. Over the 20th century, living standards rose in much of the world, and countries like India and China have moved into the middle income category. This progress shows that growth is possible when productivity increases through industrialization, education, and technological innovation. Governments have also played a major role in this development by investing in infrastructure, promoting industry, and supporting social programs that help lift populations out of poverty. Dependency theory, on the other hand, reminds us that global inequality isn't only an economic problem, it's also a political one. It draws attention to how the world's wealth and power are distributed and how certain countries continue to hold economic and political advantages over others. Inequality, then, isn't just about who produces more. It's about who controls resources and decision-making. Without addressing these political imbalances, real progress toward equality will remain limited. At the same time, the rapid growth of the global economy has come with environmental strain. As nations develop, they consume more resources, produce more waste, and place increasing pressure on ecosystems. Sustainable development, growth that meets human needs without destroying the planet, will be one of the key challenges moving forward. Ultimately, the future of global stratification depends on how well the world balances economic growth, political fairness, and environmental responsibility. Progress must come with dignity and security for all people. As we move further into the 21st century, the hope is that development can continue without deepening inequality or damaging the planet that sustains us.